Listen, in the spring of 1843, a woman from Missouri packed a 10-foot wagon with 200 pounds of flour, 100 pounds of bacon, and every scrap of iron and grit she needed to feed her family for 5 grueling months on the American frontier. She would walk most of the 2,170 miles to Oregon, not out of a sense of adventure, but because the wagon was already groaning under the weight of survival and was far too heavy for her to ride in. She would cook 3 meals a day over flickering fires fueled by dried buffalo dung in the driving rain, in the howling wind, and on a seasoned cast-iron skillet she dragged across the spine of an entire continent. These were the forgotten, high-calorie, traditional American home and working-class meals that sustained the dream of the West. Long before the sanitized versions of history made it into the schoolbooks or the Hollywood silver screen. Number 9 on this list required nothing but an American wagon in constant motion and a simple bucket of trail milk, while number 3 was fashioned from an ingredient she found crusted along the alkaline banks of an American river with no name on any map she owned. And number 1, a supper so simple it had no real name in the Missouri or Kansas camps, was so good that modern food historians in 2024 gave it nearly an 8 out of 10 for flavor and soul. These are not the recipes Hollywood remembered, nor are they the refined dishes of the East Coast elite. These are the rugged, heavy, salt-stained meals that kept 250,000 people alive across 20 years of the most ambitious and desperate migration in American history. As we look back at these forgotten meals from the American farm table and the lumber camp cookery of our ancestors, we find a story written in grease, flour, and the kind of American resourcefulness that turns scarcity into a feast. The history of the United States is often told through battles and treaties, but the true history of America was forged in the heat of a Dutch oven and the steam rising from a Missouri woman's kettle. Every part of this journey was a testament to American tenacity, a refusal to let the vast, empty spaces of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains swallow up the traditions of the American home. These were meals born of necessity in the small-town kitchens of the Midwest and carried into the wilderness, where the only constant was the heat of the fire and the weight of the hunger. This was the era of the frontier hearth, where the American spirit was tested by every mile and every pound of salt pork. To understand the American heart, you have to understand the American stomach of the 1840s and 50s, back when a meal wasn't a choice but a hard-won victory against the elements. We are talking about the soul of American foodways, the skillet cornbread, the thick stews, and the heavy, calorie-dense fuel that allowed ordinary families to do the extraordinary. This is the story of the Oregon Trail, told through the steam of the coffee and the crust of the biscuit, a narrative of American working-class endurance that still resonates in our kitchens today. We're counting down the 15 forgotten meals pioneer women actually cooked on the Oregon Trail, beginning with number 15, camp coffee. It was the meal that began before the American sunrise every single day, when women rose in the shivering dark to revive the prior night's fire from the gray ashes of the Missouri or Nebraska earth. This was the first task of every morning on the trail for 5 months straight, a ritual of roasting green coffee beans in a dry cast-iron skillet until they turned a deep, oily dark. Then, grinding them in a hand mill and brewing them directly in boiling water over the open flame. The wagon train carried 5 pounds of coffee per person for the entire journey, a vital American commodity that separated the dark from the day. When supplies inevitably ran short, these resilient American women brewed roasted corn or dried peas in its place, calling it coffee anyway to maintain a semblance of the home they left behind, even if it tasted like neither. Every pioneer diary that survived the trail mentions coffee in the very first sentence, not the majestic scenery of the American West or the constant fear of the unknown, but the coffee, because in the American wilderness, that warmth was what kept people moving. The weight of the American dream was measured in more than just miles. It was calculated in the cold, hard numbers of farm ledgers and the unforgiving pressure of the American economy in the mid-19th century. Families from Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri often sold everything they owned. Farms that had been in the family for generations, livestock, and heirloom furniture, just to afford the basic supplies for the crossing, leaving them with a profound sense of social vertigo as they traded their status as established landowners for the life of a dusty, tired emigrant. There was a quiet, biting shame in the poor food of the trail. The kind of meals that back in the settled towns of the East or the established kitchens of New England were whispered about as the diet of the destitute. Yet here on the American high plains, these dishes were the only thing standing between a family and starvation. The weather was a constant, crushing weight as the American interior threw everything from blistering heat to sudden, freezing prairie gales at the slow-moving caravans, turning the act of cooking into a desperate battle against damp wood and shivering limbs. Number 14 on our list is cornmeal mush, the breakfast that nobody in the American Midwest loved but nobody ever left behind in the wagon box. A single cup of yellow or white cornmeal stirred into a pot of boiling water until it thickened into a heavy gray porridge. This was the standard American breakfast on most mornings of the 5-month crossing. Pioneer women had been making versions of this since the American colonial era, when settlers first switched from the traditional oat porridge of the Old World to the indigenous corn version, calling it hasty pudding in the New England states and simply mush nearly everywhere else in the American South and West. It traveled as dry cornmeal, light enough to pack in great quantity, and it could be cooked in under 15 minutes over a small, sputtering fire, while the American sun was still just a promise on the horizon. A splash of molasses made it edible to the children, and a splash of milk from the trail cow made it almost feel like a real American home meal, though every child who grew up crossing the Oregon Trail associated the smell of it with the particular, lonely gray of early morning light on the high plains of Nebraska or Wyoming. They didn't remember it fondly, but they remembered it with a fierce clarity because it meant they were still alive to taste the American dust. The pressure of the American Trail meant that even the bread had to be stripped of its joy and reduced to its most basic, durable form, leading us to number 13, hardtack. Known as the bread that could outlast the journey, this was a simple, brutal mixture of American flour, water, and salt, baked hard enough to last for months in a wooden wagon box without spoiling in the humid Missouri heat or the dry mountain air. Pioneer women often baked massive batches of hardtack before leaving their homes in Missouri because American trail guides specifically recommended it as emergency bread that could survive any conditions the crossing would produce. It survived the river crossings, the dust storms, and the vibration of the iron-rimmed wheels, becoming dense, pale, and resistant to every tooth in the family. American trail diaries recorded the standard method for tackling this stone-like staple. It was soaked in water or the morning's bitter coffee until it was soft enough to chew, or crumbled into whatever thin soup was available at the evening fire. Children along the trail, with the typical American wit of the time, called it sheet iron, while the mothers, exhausted by the endless cycle of labor, simply called it Tuesday. A single batch of this American survival bread, mixed right in the flour sack and baked over a campfire before the initial departure, could feed a family through the long stretches between American rivers where fuel was too scarce to cook anything more ambitious. There was no room for the soft, yeasty loaves of the Philadelphia or New York bakeries here. There was only the cast-iron discipline of the trail and the hard, salt-crusted reality of American hardtack. This was the food of the American working class on the move, a testament to the fact that on the Oregon Trail, the most important ingredient in any meal was the sheer, stubborn will to see the sun rise over the next American ridge. The architecture of survival on the American frontier was built on the smallest of foundations, often beginning with number 12. Parched corn, the pocket-sized ration that fueled the American expansion. Captain Randolph Marcy, whose government-issued guidebook every American emigrant carried like a second Bible, wrote that half a bushel of this parched corn was sufficient to sustain a man for 30 days of hard travel across the plains. Pioneer women from the Missouri Valley made it before even hitching the oxen, roasting dry corn kernels in a seasoned cast-iron skillet, until they turned a deep toasted brown and hardened into a durable flint. When crushed in a mortar, with a bit of precious American sugar and cinnamon, it became what Marcy called cold flour, a versatile American staple that could be mixed with a splash of water to form a meal or eaten dry as a day's emergency ration tucked away in a coat pocket. Children chewed these kernels as they walked alongside the wagons on days when the American wind was too fierce or the fuel too scarce to stop for a proper cook fire. It cost almost nothing to produce in a Missouri smokehouse. It weighed almost nothing to carry in a burlap sack, and on the stretches of the crossing where the American Trail offered nothing but dust and sagebrush. Parched corn was the thin line between eating and not eating. This leads us to number 11, the salt pork and bacon that served as the heavy grease for every other American meal on the trail. The recommended load for a family of 4 was staggering: 100 pounds of bacon per person, a figure that only made sense when you understood that bacon on the American frontier was not a breakfast side dish. It was the primary cooking medium, the flavor base, and the essential protein source for virtually every meal of the crossing. Pioneer women fried it in the morning and meticulously rendered every drop of the fat to cook the biscuits, the beans, and the cornmeal mush that would follow, ensuring that nothing from the American smokehouse was discarded. Salt pork traveled in wooden barrels, packed with bran to absorb the moisture. And it was a miracle of American preservation that it could cross a 3,000-mile continent without spoiling in the heat. By the second month on the trail, American families were eating meat that had been cured in Missouri, months before they ever saw the Rockies, meat that had survived 3 river crossings and the relentless vibration of the wagons. Yet they fried it anyway, because on the American trail, the taste of salt and smoke was enough to keep the spirit whole. Here we encounter our first pattern break, revealing what the American history books consistently fail to mention about the building of this country. While official records documented the men who scouted the American passes and led the wagon trains, the diaries that survived, the ones that truly documented how the American West was won, were disproportionately written by women. They recorded the food with the clinical precision of engineers, for whom a meal was not a background detail, but the central engineering problem of every single American day. The question wasn't just what to eat, but how do you bake bread without an American oven in a drenching Kansas rain, using wet buffalo dung for fuel, while tending to a sick child and knowing there are still 17 miles of American wilderness to cover before nightfall? These American women solved that problem daily for 5 months, and while they did not get the bronze statues or the celebrated place in the American mythos, they got the next meal ready. This ingenuity is best seen in number 10, Saleratus biscuits, the bread that saved the American trail. Saleratus was a chalk-white powder, a precursor to modern American baking soda, and it was the secret ingredient that made leavened bread possible without yeast, without time, and without a stationary American kitchen. Pioneer women mixed Missouri flour, rendered lard, and a pinch of saleratus in a tin bowl, formed a rough dough, and baked it in a Dutch oven set directly on the white-hot coals. The biscuits came out pale, dense, and with that faintly bitter tang of the American frontier, serving as the closest thing to real home-baked bread the trail could produce. When the commercial tin of powder inevitably ran out near the American continental divide, these resilient women gathered a white crystalline crust that formed naturally around certain soda springs near the Sweetwater River in Wyoming. It worked, even if it was slightly more bitter, and on a crossing that required 15 to 20 miles of walking per day, a hot American biscuit at supper was not just comfort food, it was the high-calorie fuel that powered the American dream westward. Number 9 on our list was an American miracle born of physics and the rolling prairie, wagon-churned butter. Every morning after milking the trail cow, pioneer women poured fresh milk into sealed buckets and hung them from the undercarriage of the wagon. They didn't have the time to sit and churn by hand. They had a continent to cross. As the American wagon jolted over the rough Missouri soil and the deep ruts of the Kansas territory for 15 miles a day, the constant motion did the work for them. By the time the train stopped for the evening, the cream had separated and churned itself into fresh butter. A morale event that felt like a holiday in a world made of hardtack and salt pork. This wasn't an accident. It was a technique American trail guides specifically recommended to keep families fed. Then came number 8, the corn pancakes that required the kind of speed and skill only an American camp cook could master. Using American cornmeal, saleratus, and an egg if the trail hens were cooperating, these pancakes were poured onto a smoking hot cast iron skillet greased with thick bacon fat. The edges came out lacy and thin where the batter spread across the iron, while the center stayed dense enough to stick to a man's ribs through a day of mountain climbing. Some women became so legendary with their American skillet work that they would flip these pancakes in the air to the cheers of the camp. A small performance of American joy in a landscape that tried to strip away every comfort. We have to talk about the weight limit, because in the American West, 2,000 pounds wasn't a suggestion, it was a law of physics. A family of 4 needed nearly 1,800 pounds of food just to survive the crossing, leaving almost no room for the comforts of an American home. This was where the American memory often fails. because history remembers the maps and the scouts, but it often erases the women who had to choose between a family quilt and a Dutch oven. Every item in that prairie schooner had been argued over and weighed by a woman who knew that an overloaded wagon meant a broken axle, and a broken axle in the middle of the American desert meant death. They left behind the heavy iron stoves and the ornate furniture of the East, choosing instead the versatility of the American Dutch oven, which could bake bread, simmer stew, and fry meat all in the same pot. This brings us to number 7, the trail bean stew, the smoky heart of the American crossing. Half a bushel of dried beans was the recommended minimum, soaked overnight, and then set on the coals as the wagon moved. By evening, the beans had broken down into a thick, smoky broth perfumed by American salt pork and a spoonful of molasses that caramelized into something deeply savory. This was the meal American trail diaries mentioned most consistently, because after a 15-mile walk through the American wilderness, a hot bowl of something thick was more than food. It was a reason to keep going. When the American weather turned foul and there was no time to even set the pot, women turned to number 6, bread on a stick. They would mix Missouri flour and water right in the top of the flour sack, twist the dough around a green branch, and hold it over the American fire until it charred on the outside and stayed soft and doughy within. It required no pan, no lid, and no ceremony, just the understanding that American bread in any form was a victory. And for those rare nights when the camp felt like a community again, there was number 5, the dried apple pie. These American apples traveled in burlap sacks, weighing almost nothing, only to be simmered in water and sugar until they plumped back into a filling that tasted like the American orchards they had left behind. Baked in the Dutch oven with a lard crust, it was a festive reward for surviving another day on the American trail. Finally, number 4 reminds us that the American land sometimes gave back: fresh buffalo stew. When hunting went well on the high plains, the men brought fresh American bison to the camp cook. She would brown the meat in bacon fat, add wild American onions if they could be found near the creek, and let the whole pot simmer until the tough prairie meat became tender. It was a meal that tasted like the American plains had finally offered a gift in return for the struggle, a fresh protein that turned a camp into a home for one fleeting night under the American stars. Number 3 on our list is saleratus bread from the river, a meal fashioned from an ingredient she found crusted along the alkaline banks of a nameless American waterway. Between the Sweetwater River and the South Pass, American emigrants discovered something that no merchant had sold them back in Missouri. Around certain springs in the Wyoming desert, a crystalline powder formed naturally in crusts along the water's edge, natural sodium carbonate, the same chemical compound as the saleratus they had carried in tins. Pioneer women scraped it from the American ground, dissolved it in water, and used it to leaven their bread on evenings when the commercial supply had long since run out. The bread it produced was slightly more bitter than the biscuits made in a Missouri kitchen, but nobody minded the tang of the American soil. Helen Carpenter, whose trail diary documented the crossing with the precision of a woman who took nothing for granted, wrote that the pioneers had become impervious to what would kill ordinary mortals, and she was right about the American food too. It was a final lesson in American resourcefulness, finding the very building blocks of life in the crust of a riverbed that didn't even appear on their maps. This brings us to the final pattern break, the number that changes everything we think we know about the American West. An estimated 250,000 to 500,000 people crossed the Oregon Trail between 1841 and 1869, and the vast majority of them arrived at their destination. They survived because of these 15 meals, eaten in a relentless rotation for 5 months as they walked across the American heartland. At the end of the journey, it was not the men's formal accounts that documented the gritty reality of what had been survived. It was the American diaries. These were written at night, in the flicker of a lantern or the dying glow of a fire, after the children were asleep, and the next day's American beans were already soaking in a bucket. These records were kept by women who had figured out how to feed a family across an entire continent with nothing but a cast iron pot and a flour sack. They wrote it all down so that the American legacy of the trail would not be lost to time, ensuring that the labor of the American camp cook was never fully erased from the national record. Number 2 is the impossible American dessert that actually happened: trail ice cream. Between the Sweetwater River and South Pass, the trail ran through a stretch known as Ice Springs, where even in the heat of an American summer, The ground held ice from the previous winter buried just below the surface. In 1849, American travelers dug down with their shovels and found clean, clear ice hidden in the Wyoming dirt. Pioneer women seized the opportunity, mixing their precious trail milk with sugar and whatever flavoring they could find: peppermint oil, American molasses, or chopped dried fruit. They packed the mixture into tin containers and buried them in the ice for an hour while the wagons rested. The result was ice cream in the middle of the high American desert, a welcome surprise recorded by Dr. William Thomas in his diary as one of the most miraculous moments of the entire crossing. The American children did not need the science explained. They simply ate the cold, sweet treat before the desert sun could turn it back into memories. Finally, we reach number 1. Pinto beans, salt pork, and biscuits. The American supper that earned a nearly perfect score from modern historians. This was a pot of pinto beans soaked overnight in an American bucket, simmered with thick slabs of salt pork, and a spoonful of Missouri molasses added in the morning. The Dutch oven moved with the wagon for 15 miles, simmering on low coals the whole way, until by evening the beans were thick, smoky, and slightly sweet where the molasses had caramelized into the rich American broth. The saleratus biscuits were baked in those same coals, and when the bean broth was poured over the hot, split biscuits, it created a meal that food writers in 2024 gave nearly an 8 out of 10. Those writers were eating it in the comfort of a warm kitchen, but pioneer women made it after walking 15 miles through American mud, with a broken wagon wheel and a heavy heart. It was a very good meal because of who made it and the American grit it took to get it onto the plate. While these episodes compress months of American hardship into minutes of film, the reality was a long, slow burn of endurance that built the very foundations of this country. These 15 meals represent the forgotten American traditions of the working class, the recipes that were never written in fine cookbooks, but lived in the hands and hearts of the women who walked the West. The history of the United States is a history of the American table, and we invite you to keep that history alive by trying this trail supper in your own American kitchen this week. Make the pinto beans with salt pork and molasses, bake those biscuits in a cast iron pan, and see if you can taste the heritage of the frontier in every bite. Tell me in the comments if the biscuits taste different from every other biscuit you have ever made, because they do. If your American grandmother or great-grandmother carried a recipe across the plains or kept a tradition alive in a small-town American kitchen, we want to hear her story, because those are the stories that truly built this nation.